Good morning. It's 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, and we are back for another session of Practical Parsha. Welcome to one and all. I see that everybody is logging on Facebook as well as YouTube. So first of all, welcome. And those of you that listen to this later, either on the social media platforms or as a podcast, nice to have you tuning in to our weekly Practical Parsha session. I'm not going to welcome everybody personally as you're logging in or sharing your messages. I still encourage you to share those messages. I am seeing them on Facebook and on YouTube. So please do share. But because we want to keep this current and relevant even to viewers and listeners later on in the day or the week, I'm not going to highlight individual names. If you have any topics or questions you'd like to post, questions or comments, please do feel free to post them. I will engage. We'll read out the question, read out the comment, and engage for our listeners and our viewers to be able to benefit from that as well, even later. This Practical Parsha session obviously delves into the weekly Parsha, but the goal is to take out some practical messages. In a world of today, we need the inspiration, we need the upliftment, we need the hope that Torah gives us. And that weekly Parsha, that weekly portion is so relevant and connects so well to what we're experiencing and going through. Now that's the goal of this half an hour session, is to unpack a topic, an idea, a thought in the Parsha, from the Parsha, and to apply it practically to our lives that we're living in today. So welcome aboard to one and all. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you back for another session. The feedback to last week's class was phenomenal, so thank you all. And we're going to get going as well this morning for another session of Practical Parsha. I see comments are coming through. Thank you all for your greetings. And as I get going, once again, I encourage for your questions and your comments as we move along. So this coming week of Parshat Lech Lecha, we learn about a ritual that is so common in Jewish life. So common in Jewish life is the ritual of the Brit Milah, the circumcision, which is a milestone event in our lives. It's a milestone event in our lives as children, as parents, and as grandparents. The Brit Milah, the circumcision. And even though obviously the mitzvah of Brit Milah is only performed on males, on men, nonetheless the message of the Brit Milah, the message of the circumcision, is so relevant both to males and females too. So that's what today is about, is not so much about the practicalities and the legalities of the Brit Milah, the circumcision process, but rather to delve into the Brit Milah and to understand some messages that are so relevant to all of us, male and female alike. So there's a bracha that we say that at a Brit Milah. The father says a bracha. He says the following words. Listen to the bracha that we say for a bris. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam. Blessed is God, the King of the universe. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, that He has sanctified us through His mitzvot. V'tzivanu, and commanded us. Lahachniso bevrito shel Avraham Avinu, to bring our child into the bris of Avraham Avinu. It's an amazing, amazing statement that I, as a father, as a mother, as a parent, who are bringing our child to a Brit Milah, to circumcision, we are bringing him lahachniso, we're bringing him in bivrito shel Avraham Avinu, into the bris, into the circumcision, or into the covenant of Avraham Avinu. The tradition passes down from generation to generation. Thousands of years, children are having a bris. Bivrito shel Avraham Avinu, the bris of our forefather Avraham Avinu. It's quite a phenomenal emotional feeling to be performing a mitzvah that's being passed down from Abraham to Yitzchak to Yaakov to the 12 tribes and all the way through Jewish history until we stand by a bris today, by circumcision, by Brit Milah. We stand there by Brit Milah and we too participate in that mitzvah. That's an amazing, amazing phenomenon. That's a very emotional, it's an emotion. I'm not sure how many of us think about this when we stand at a bris. We're normally involved with our friends and we're socializing and we're connecting and we're drinking and we're eating. But I don't know how many of us have stopped for a moment to think that this tradition is passing down from generation to generation. We are still doing La'achniso Bivrito Shel Avraham Avinu. We're still performing the mitzvah of Avraham Avinu. But there's a question. There's a question. Maimonides actually writes something very, very interesting. Maimonides says clearly that we do not perform the mitzvah of Brit Milah, of circumcision, because Hashem told Avraham Avinu, because of Avraham, our forefather. This happens to be the theme of this week's Parsha, Parsha Lech Lecha, is Hashem promising Avraham, or asking Avraham, requesting of Avraham, to circumcise himself and Yishmael, who was 13 years old. We know that as a result of the circumcision of Avraham, Yitzchak was then born, because Yitzchak had to be born to a circumcised father, Avraham. And later on, he was then commanded to circumcise Yitzchak at 8 days old. So this is this week's Parsha, but the Rambam Maimonides says we don't circumcise our children because of Avraham Avinu, because Avraham was commanded to circumcise himself. You know, kavanah and intent of a mitzvah is so important. We don't just do mitzvot. We actually have intent. We have to have kavanah. We have to understand what we are doing and why we are doing it. That's such an important aspect of the performance of a mitzvah, the kavanah. Why do I light Shabbos candles? Why do I go to the mikveh? Why do I put on tefillin? These are questions we should be asking ourselves, not just how do I do it, but why do I do it? What's the background to it? What's the meaning behind it? And so the Rambam is clarifying, Maimonides is clarifying for us, why do we perform the Brit Milah? Why do we perform the circumcision? And he clarifies, he says, don't get it wrong. You're not doing it because of Avraham Avinu. That's not why you're circumcising your child. But rather, why do we circumcise our children? He says because at Mount Sinai, years later, many more years later, at Mount Sinai, we stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, and there God gave us the Torah. And in the Torah, he commanded Moshe Rabbeinu, he told Moshe Rabbeinu, pass down to the Jewish people. Pass on the mitzvah of circumcision, of Brit Milah, to circumcise every male child. And Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain, and one of the mitzvot he gave us was the mitzvah of Brit Milah. Says the Rambam Maimonides, this is why we do the mitzvah of circumcision. We do it because Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, to pass it down to us, and now we do it ourselves. Not because of Avraham, but rather because of Moshe. Because Moses. Because Moshe was told to pass it down to us. And this only creates question. Because then why is the father of the child, on behalf of the mother, together as a couple, why do they say the words La'achniso bivrito shel Avraham Avinu? We have a commandment to bring our child into the Brit Milah of Avraham Avinu. The Rambam says clearly, Maimonides tells us that's not why we perform the mitzvah. Remember, Avraham was told in this week's Parsha, Avraham was told to do it. It wasn't yet a mitzvah for future generations, an eternal commandment. When Abraham was told to do it, it was a personal mitzvah for him and his family. So why do we do it? We're not part of Abraham's family. We're part of Am Yisrael, the nation of Abraham. So why do we circumcise? Says the Rambam, because Moshe Rabbeinu taught us. Moshe Rabbeinu taught us and instructed us. So then why do we say the words, La'achniso bivrito shel Avraham Avinu? Why do we mention at the bris that we're bringing the child into the Brit Milah, the circumcision of Abraham? So I want to park that question for a moment because we will come back to address that. We will come back to answer that. So let's park that question and let me share with you another discussion, another idea. When does the soul of a child enter into his body and her body? When did they get a neshama? Have you ever thought about this? We talk about a neshama, a godly soul, part of Hashem inside of us. So when is that moment that the neshama enters our body? Some will say, well, it's the bris, it's the birth, it's the bat mitzvah, it's the bar mitzvah. So in fact, the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Law, says that the neshama enters the body at bar and bat mitzvah. Fascinating. Meaning up until that point in time, up until the age of 12 or 13, depending on whether it's a boy or girl, the child is functioning physically, but not yet functioning spiritually. That's why the child is not obligated in mitzvot, because they have no neshama, they have no soul. It's only once you get a neshama, once you get a soul, do you become responsible for your actions. Up until that point, they're functioning physically, humanly, and therefore can't be held responsible for their actions. So it happens at bar and bat mitzvah. There's many halachic ramifications as a result of this, which is fascinating in its own right. One of them being nitilat yadayim, washing of our hands. That a person has to wash their hands to purify themselves. It only applies to an adult, not a child, because the adult has the neshama, the child doesn't. The only reason we wash the hands of a child is for chinuch and education purposes. But we'll leave that discussion for now. Let's get back to the question, when does the neshama, when does the soul enter the body? So, Code of Law, as I said, says bar and bat mitzvah. But it says more than that. The wording is from the Code of Law. In the Shulchan Aruch Harav, he writes, the beginning of the knisa, of the entering of the soul into the child's body, begins at the Brit Milah. It begins at the circumcision. Obviously, for a girl who's born, they don't need this to go through this process. But for a boy, this process is necessary. The beginning of the neshama comes into the baby at the circumcision, at the Brit Milah. The process continues all the way through to the bar and bat mitzvah. But the beginning of the process begins at birth for baby girls, at the Brit Milah, at circumcision for baby boys. But I want to focus on the Brit Milah specifically. What do you mean the neshama? What do you mean the soul only starts at the Brit Milah and continues all the way through to the bar mitzvah? Really? So what was inside the baby, the fetus, inside the mother's womb? How did the baby survive and exist in the mother's womb during the 9 months of pregnancy? Was there no soul there? Was there no neshama there? We know that a baby learns Torah for 9 months. The malachim have a chavrusa, have a one-on-one session with the fetus, with the baby, to learn Torah during the 9 months of pregnancy. So what does it mean that the beginning of the process of the soul entering the body of the baby begins at the Brit Milah? What happened before that? What was at the time of pregnancy? And the answer is that at that point in time, the soul was there, but it wasn't united and connected to the body. The soul and the body during the 9 months of pregnancy remain totally separate existences. They're obviously linked, but they're totally separate. They're not joined. When does the soul join the body? When does a neshama enter into the body, meaning permeate the physical? When does a godly permeate the physical? And the answer is at the Brit Milah. When a baby is circumcised and one performs the mitzvah of circumcision, by doing that, the mitzvah binds together, connects together. The neshama connects together with the body. So in 9 months of pregnancy, they weren't one yet. It was specifically through the Brit Milah that they become one. And as I mentioned, girls, females don't necessarily have to go through this process. But for the moment of birth, the neshama permeates them. The neshama permeates the girl, the young girl, the baby. But for the boy, the Brit Milah is what enables godliness to permeate the physical. And this, in a way, by the Brit, by the circumcision, is more than just a regular mitzvah. Because a regular mitzvah, we don't connect with a regular mitzvah where it permeates us to such an extent. Think about any other mitzvah that we do. Immersing in a body of water of the mikveh. Although we're immersed in a body of water and we're totally encompassed, we still remain two separate entities. The reality is I can get out of the water and I'm no longer part of the water. Every other mitzvah we do, shaking lulav and etrog, putting on tefillin, blowing the shofar, hearing the Megillah, every other mitzvah that we do seems to remain a separate entity. We'll figure out now that's not the truth. The truth is that every mitzvah binds with us, connects with us, and we connect with it. Every mitzvah permeates the physicality and the flesh of our bodies, but it is emphasized and highlighted more by the Brit Milah, by the circumcision. That's where the neshama, that's where the mitzvah actually permeates the physical. When it leaves an internal impression on the physical body, that is when spiritual and physical combine. Just want to mention that the Zohar actually says that male and female are two halves of one soul. And therefore the Brit Milah that the male goes through is actually being fulfilled on behalf of both the male and the female halves. So a woman, although she doesn't go through a Brit Milah through circumcision, because her other half of the neshama, the other half of the soul, did go through the physical, the circumcision part, she fulfills that obligation. She experiences that as well. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to the discussion of a Brit Milah. So we're highlighting the advantage of a bris over other mitzvahs. Other mitzvahs still seem to remain separate from us. A Brit Milah, circumcision, permeates us, unites with us, connects with our physical bodies. Any questions or comments on what we've discussed until this point, feel free to post them. I'd love to address them if there are. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to communicate with me personally too, and I'd be very, very happy to follow up on this discussion. The title of this talk was, Is Judaism Always Logical? Well, although we try to make Judaism logical, and we are obligated to try and think through every aspect and every detail of Judaism, is Judaism always logical? No, it's not. Because look at the circumcision at the Brit Milah. The Brit Milah circumcision for Yishmael was very different to the circumcision of Yitzchak. Yishmael was circumcised together with Avraham at the age of 13. He was already an adult. But that's why Yishmael is not our forefather. Our forefather Yitzchak had a Brit Milah circumcision at 8 days old. There's no logic for an 8-day child. And yet the child is obligated, or the parents are obligated to circumcise the child. But the child is fulfilling that mitzvah. In fact, Brit, the word Brit, comes to the numerical value of 612. Now, what happened to 613 commandments? Brit is 612. And the answer is, the parents tell the child, we've helped you with the first mitzvah. We've helped you perform the first mitzvah of the Brit Milah. Now it's your obligation to go ahead and fulfill the rest of the 612 mitzvot throughout your life. So the Brit Milah is performed at an illogical state of the child. The child hasn't agreed intellectually with his seichel. You know why? Because we want the mitzvah to permeate the flesh, the physical body. That's what we want. It's not a mitzvah that's dependent on seichel. It's not a mitzvah that's dependent on emotion. Mitzvahs have to permeate the physical lives of our homes, of our families, of our bodies. And the Brit Milah is a prototype that highlights that. And therefore it's illogical. Because the more logical it becomes, it's less of a physical mitzvah. It remains as a spiritual or an emotional mitzvah. We want this mitzvah, the Brit Milah, to permeate the physicality. Even though there's no spiritual or logical inspiration to the performance of a Brit Milah, because a child is illogical, is too young, nonetheless, it permeates the physical flesh. And that ultimately is the purpose of a circumcision. That doesn't mean that Judaism shouldn't be logical. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand Judaism along the way. Absolutely, we should. To the best of our abilities. We've been given brains for a reason. We've been given hearts for a reason. We've got to use the emotional and intellectual. But we've got to realize that at a certain point, Judaism isn't always logical. And the Brit Milah, the circumcision, is the prototype, is the example of that. And this may help us appreciate why Avraham Avinu is such an important element here. Avraham Avinu. There's something unique about Avraham. In fact, the sages and the commentaries debate and they discuss what was unique to Avraham. In other words, if you and I were there and God told us to do these things, would we have done it? Many people perform the Brit Milah today. Many people perform Mesirut Nefesh, self-sacrifice. They give their lives away for Judaism today. So what makes Avraham so unique? What makes Avraham so unique is the fact that he was the first. No one had given their lives for Judaism, for God, for belief before Avraham. He was first. Nobody had circumcised themselves before Avraham. He was the first. That's unique. Avraham was willing to be the first. And you know what happens when you're the first? When you're the first in something, everyone follows. You know, it's like the marathons. When a person manages to beat a certain speed, and they're the first to reach or to accomplish a world record speed in the marathon, the next racers, the next runners can easily attain it. As long as nobody has done it, everyone's scared to even try. Oh, who can even reach that sort of speed? It's impossible. But the moment one person has accomplished it, everyone else now knows it's possible. And so Avraham Avinu's character trait was unique in the fact that he was first. And then we followed. And all the mitzvot that we do, and all the self-sacrifice that we do, and all the circumcisions that we do, we've got the inspiration of Avraham Avinu, the first. Now, that's very unique to a Brit Milah. Very unique to a circumcision. Because normally, we perform things based on precedence. Normally, when you see someone else accomplishing something or performing something or reaching a world record, logically we start processing things. Well, if so-and-so and so-and-so can do it, I can also do it. If that runner can reach that speed, I can also reach that speed. So generally, we base our performance, we base our practices based on what other people are doing. If someone else has done it, I'll do it too. If someone else can reach that speed, I can reach it too. But when it comes to the circumcision, it's not the same. There's no concept of precedence by a Brit Milah, by a circumcision. Because the baby's not logical enough. As we said, the Brit Milah, the circumcision, is one of those mitzvot that are illogical. The child's 8 days old. How on earth are they going to process anything intellectually and emotionally? They're not looking at the fact that their father did a bris, therefore they should do a bris, or their grandfather did a bris, therefore they should do a bris. When a child is 8 days old, there is no such logic. There's no such process of precedence or logic or relying on someone who's previously performed this particular act. When I'm 8 days old and I don't understand what I'm doing, and it's totally illogical, God says, you are like Avraham. You are like Avraham. If we rely to answer the question that we started with, why are we highlighting Avraham as the source of the Brit Milah, of the circumcision, in the father's blessing when he circumcises his child? Surely, as the Rambam writes, Maimonides says, the mitzvah that we do, the Brit Milah that we do, is because Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded to do so. It's true, that is the reason why we perform the mitzvah, because Moshe Rabbeinu was told to do so at Mount Sinai and pass down the mitzvah to us. But mentioning Moshe as the source implies that there's an element of precedence here. Moshe Rabbeinu did it, he commanded it to the next generation, and they commanded it to the next generation, and they commanded it to the next generation, and then we lose the specialty and the uniqueness of the Brit Milah. There's something very powerful about the Brit. There's no precedence to a Brit Milah. I'm doing it because I'm 8 days old and I don't understand what I'm doing, but I'm doing it because Judaism is so deeply enrooted inside of me. That's why I'm doing it. There's no logic. There's no emotion. There's no precedence to a child 8 days old who's having a bris. That's because my entire Judaism is that. My entire Judaism is beyond logic. Although I try to use my mind and my brain to the best of my ability, but I also acknowledge that ultimately Judaism is illogical. It's deeper than logic. So it's not based on my intellect, it's not based on my emotion, it's not even based on precedence. I, like Avraham, I'm the first one who's doing it. That's why I'm like Avraham. He did it first with no precedence, and I, as an 8-day-old child, also do it first with no precedence, because there's no logic, there's no emotion, there's no precedence. I'm doing it because God commanded me to do it. That's why we mention Lachniso Bivrito Shel Avraham Avinu. That's why we say that it's a mitzvah that should be permeated into our bodies, one with our bodies, the physical, and I'm the first one to do it. Every child is that first one to do it. And the truth is, as I mentioned at the beginning, It's not so much a shir or a talk or a discussion on circumcision. It's more of a talk on Judaism and life. It's relevant to both males and females, because so often we depend and we define our Jewish observance based on logic. It's got to make sense. I've got to understand it. What are other people doing? Is there a precedence to this? What did my father do or my grandfather do? What's my next door neighbor doing? Or what's my friend down the road doing? That's how we start to process things. And I behave the way they behave. And I mirror them. Well, maybe that's not the correct approach to Judaism. Judaism isn't always logical. It doesn't always make sense. While logic is an important variable of Jewish life, but Judaism is not based on logic. And the Brit Milah is the prototype, is the example of this, where we're performing a mitzvah at the age of 8 days old, where there is no seichel, there is no intellect, there is no emotion, and there's not even a precedent. I'm not even looking at someone else. I'm doing it because I want to do it, and I want to be part of, and I'm part of God's creation, God's world. And that is a lesson that we should learn, not just for circumcision, but for every aspect of Jewish life. Obviously, we sense and we pick up these details in the Brit, in the circumcision, more than any other mitzvah, as I explained. But we have to try and live that idea in every aspect of Jewish observance as well. So just to summarize quickly, especially for those who may have joined us midway through the discussion, we mentioned how Avraham Avinu, in this week's Parsha, Parsha Lech Lecha, is the first one that's commanded to circumcise himself. And in fact, we say that in the bracha. The father says that in the bracha when he circumcises his child. But we ask the question, Maimonides, Rambam, says that we don't circumcise our children because of Avraham, but rather because God commanded Moses at Mount Sinai. That's why we circumcise our children. To answer this, we discussed the idea of a neshama entering a body and becoming one with the body, which happens at the time of the circumcision. Where at the circumcision, there's no intellect or emotion. It's the mitzvah that permeates the physicality of the human body. And this explains why we want to mention Avraham. We mention Avraham because Avraham was the first. We mention Avraham because I, the child, every one of the children that we circumcise is a first. Is acceptance of godliness, acceptance of Judaism, acceptance of the mitzvot, not because of logic and not because of precedent, but because God is one with us and we are one with God. That is the foundation of Jewish life. I appreciate you all joining us here today for another session of Practical Parsha. Is Judaism always logical? I hope you've benefited. I hope you've gained. I hope you've learned something new to share with your families around the Shabbos table. And once again, we're going to send out the link. It's going to be on YouTube. It's on Facebook. People can log in and watch it afterwards. If there's any questions or comments you'd like to discuss with me, feel free to contact me personally. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, a wonderful week ahead.